I'm very happy to say that now is going to be the second talk that I've been teasing in my keynote, talking about the in-depth data models and ideas, or in-depth ideas that I talked about. So there's a different title, but it's meaning the same thing. So Tim O'Brien, who is General Manager of AI in programs in Microsoft, came over here as well for you to talk about opportunity and responsibility in empowering developers in the AI era. So what do we do to have opportunities for us as developers, and what is our responsibility to deal with the data of our users? Without further ado, thank you very much, Tim O'Brien.
Thank you. Thank you. It's really exciting to be here because 10 of my 15 years at Microsoft were spent with the developer community. So I jumped at the chance to come talk to you today because we have a couple of pretty important things to talk about. One is the opportunity that I think we have as an industry, you certainly have as the developer community, to shape the future for this era of tech. But along with that comes a responsibility to ensure it's a future that we want. So those are the two things that we're going to talk about today. And it starts with empowerment. The mission of Microsoft is to empower every person, every organization on the planet to achieve more. The whole ethos of our company is rooted in empowerment. And AI is no different. The overarching goal for us as a platform provider is to empower developers to innovate. And there's just a ton of energy in the space today around conversational AI, around cognitive services, around real-time language translation, image recognition, machine translation of voice, video. We're seeing a ton of energy in the dev community today worldwide. And there's three kind of scenarios I think we want to talk about today. One is building AI apps and agents and how to add those capabilities to your apps. The second is this idea of mining the knowledge that exists within your companies today, but isn't necessarily reachable or easily accessible. And the third is machine learning and the work that we're doing in the platform to make it easily accessible and productive for you. So let's start with AI agents and apps. How easy is it to add this capability? It's pretty simple. Add vision to your app with image recognition. You can add speech to your app with voice-to-text conversion. You can add language to your app with natural language processing to learn and understand what your users are really asking for. All of these capabilities exist within Azure Cognitive Services. You can easily deploy these things either on the edge of the network, in the cloud, or on premises. And we're working with a number of different customers on this capability, or on applications that use this set of capabilities. And one of these customers is Adobe. Adobe is a partner of ours, obviously, but they're a customer as well. They built a learning environment called Experience League that uses these capabilities to build out a much more immersive, enhanced environment for their customers. Let's just have a quick look at what Adobe's doing.
Adobe is committed to help our customers be successful. One of the biggest things that we hear from our customers is it's hard for them to find the right skills to use the latest technology.
With Experience League, we can create a single place for all of our customers to go to get access to the best enablement resources Adobe has to offer. It uses chatbots to really reduce friction points as customers move along their learning journey. Adobe sees conversational AI as foundational to providing the personalized experiences for each of our users. The bot framework is extremely flexible. It lets us use our own backend services. We can typically go from an idea for a bot to having a working prototype in just a matter of days. Cognitive Services handles the natural language processing, and the Azure Bot Service handles sending the messages to and from the user. So that lets us focus on our user experience.
As I think about our vision for the future, I see the ability to integrate chatbots not only in Experience League, but to connect that to other services that we're engaging with our customers.
We just see tremendous potential for conversational AI to impact all parts of our business.
Conversational AI is a pretty popular point of entry for a great many of customers that are initiating their first projects in artificial intelligence. But another thing we get asked about quite a bit is how do I make use of all the data that I have today? How do I make use of all the information that exists within my environment today? Because some of it isn't necessarily useful. It's hidden away in file formats like PDF that aren't necessarily friendly. If there's anything that we've learned, I think, in the last 10 years on the web, it's that information that isn't searchable isn't particularly useful. So what if we could take an AI-first approach to accessing and unlocking that data? And that's where Azure Cognitive Search comes in. It's basically Azure Search built with cognitive capabilities. You can ingest data from a multiple of different data sources: SQL, Cosmos DB, MySQL, Azure Blob Storage, Azure Tables. And once you ingest that information into a centralized store, you can make it searchable, place it into an index, and make it searchable and reach that knowledge. So we announced this earlier this year. And in the spring, the team was working on it, preparing for the announce, and a very interesting thing happened. The United States government declassified 18,000 documents relating to the assassination of President Kennedy in 1963. This was kind of a tailor-made scenario for this new capability that we were getting ready to roll out. So the team thought, hey, timing is everything, and let's see what this can do. Let's have the team tell the story.
Hi, I'm Brian Smith.
I'm Corbin Thompson.
And we work in the Cloud and AI division here at Microsoft on Cognitive Search. Cognitive Search is an AI-first approach to content understanding. So no matter what shape your content's in, Cognitive Search gives you the ability to use all of our cognitive services to inspect and unlock all of that content and then search against it.
What we've found is that you can actually take AI in the cloud and have a dual understanding and then surface to you the most relevant bits of information. You can just compose the data you want to express. What are the things that I want to extract from my documents? And it can go and extract all information from your data source directly. It distributes all that compute in the cloud. And it puts it and organizes that knowledge inside of an index so you can easily search it. And what we're going through this process,
the government released all of their files from this JFK investigation, right? This is like 60 years of like typed and printed and handwritten and photographs and evidence and all these things.
Way you can see that the CIA, the FBI, and even Cuba was involved in all of this.
You've got a document. We needed to run like OCR on it, and we needed to run handwriting on it to find out where this thing was. So now we've got text. Then we go off and we take this text and we run all of the text through things that find entities, right? So now we've got an entity. Well, you can then link that back and you can say, here's what I understand about your content kind of in isolation. And then for anything that you want, now I can tell you everything that Bing knows about this relative to the whole world. And you can express all of that in basically 3 skills, which is really powerful.
Not only can you see that information, but it organizes it in a way that you can actually navigate the data very quickly. So what we found is we could express this as a graph, and then you can just see how each of these topics that are discussed in these documents are related to each other. And so whether you're trying to figure out who assassinated the president, or if you were just managing thousands of contracts or engineering plans, we found customers of all these industries derive value from the content that they have. You can take AI, compose it together, and unlock all the value, that latent value that you have in the content, and start putting it to good use. And all the cognitive capabilities we showed are built into Azure Search.
So you can get started today. In just a few clicks, you can go through and you can add the cognitive capabilities to your content and get it in Search Index so you can start asking these questions on your data.
And we published the code that we have, so you can just go today, put your content into the cloud, and have the same experience that we just created in just a few minutes.
But no matter what you choose to do, I think you'll be surprised to find how easy it is to take all of Microsoft's AI capabilities and use them together in Cognitive Search.
So there's 2 references there that I would point out. One was kind of a jarring shift, I think, from the Kennedy assassination to engineering workflow. But that's really the problem. It's a problem that's worth solving. Now that the cost of storing data costs next to nothing, no one is throwing away anything. And its value, it costs nothing to store, but it's locked away. Unlocking that value through this type of technology is incredibly important. And the second was the reference to the just 3 clicks, 3 skills, very, very simple to do. Right now, there's more data in the world than there are people who know how to manage it all. And so we've really made a big push or big emphasis on developer productivity to get from an idea to shipping code as quickly as possible. So that brings us to machine learning on Azure. There's a lot of information on this visual, and that's kind of the point. Many years ago, we made a decision to cast a wider net to the developer community and give you the opportunity to bring the skills that you have today to our platform, rather than having to learn a lot of Microsoft-specific syntax, whether it be tools, languages, runtimes, or anything related to that. And so our approach with machine learning is to give you that same opportunity with support for popular open source packages. All your Python skills get put to work here. So even if it's a matter of pre-trained models to shorten the path from idea to shipping code to simplify the development process. We've talked about those cognitive services a moment ago. Popular frameworks that we've built into the platform. PyTorch for deep learning, TensorFlow for numerical computation, Keras, which is a neural network API that runs on top of TensorFlow, Onyx for intelligent chatbots. All these popular open source packages and technologies exist integrated into Azure. Productivity is obviously a big deal, but it's becoming a bigger issue just given the pace of advancement in AI and machine learning in particular, and what we talked about a moment ago with all the data. So some of the services that we provide to make developers more productive, as an example. If you've not heard of Azure Databricks, it's basically Apache Spark integrated into Azure, enabled with one-click setup, support for collaboration within a work group, support for workflow. Azure Machine Learning is a service within Azure with pre-trained models, pre-provisioned OSS packages that you can run in a container like Docker. And machine learning VMs, which are virtual machines running in Azure that are pre-provisioned with popular open source packages because many developers don't get the opportunity to work within a work group of business analysts and data scientists. Sometimes you're just on your own trying to prototype, try to rapidly get something moving forward. Azure machine learning VMs give you that opportunity. Our infrastructure strategy has evolved. CPUs are obviously the basic unit of compute. Turns out GPUs are very handy and useful for processing images. So facial recognition, object image recognition APIs make great use of GPUs. But FPGA is a new technology that we've been working on to integrate into Azure over the last 5 years. Basically, we had a realization several years ago that Moore's law could no longer keep up with the throughput demands of machine learning applications. That was the problem that needed to be solved. So field programmable gate arrays give you the ability to have configurable processor architecture as opposed to traditional processors, which are basically configured at manufacturing time, and then that's it. So you can parallelize your app, get massive performance gains over traditional hardware architectures. And then deployment flexibility. You can deploy to the intelligent edge, you can deploy to the cloud, and you can deploy on premises depending on the needs of your business. Cloud server-side symmetry has been on-prem, off-prem symmetry has been a core component of our approach to cloud computing from the start. We're seeing other companies come to that realization and head down that same path themselves. That's been the approach that we've had from the beginning, and we have quite a bit of experience with this and have learned a lot along the way. So with about 15 minutes left, I want to shift and talk about the responsibility part of this. This is actually a pretty important discussion because when I was in engineering school, we never talked about any of this. Never talked about ethics. I was trying to think if I actually had an opportunity to take an ethics course at engineering school. I don't think I did. I actually wasn't introduced to it until later. Post-grad, and even that was a law class, so it almost doesn't even count in this context. So we're going to talk a little bit about this, and for us, there's 3 primary pieces to this discussion. First is privacy. We're very principled about the idea of privacy as a fundamental human right, and there's a couple of aspects to this discussion. One is the policy and regulatory discussion, which obviously takes place first and foremost here in Europe. I'm not sure if you appreciate it, but much of the world is looking at Europe saying, hey, maybe we need something like that. Maybe we need something like GDPR to govern how we think about data and personally identifiable information in our part of the world. The other aspect of it is sensitivity to data in a machine learning context. It turns out that algorithms in machine learning are very good at triangulating what we think is anonymized data to personally identify an individual. And when it happens, usually it's quite public. It happens by accident, and we've seen it do reputational damage to some of the biggest brands in the world, many in the United States. So respect for privacy, awareness that this risk exists is critically important. Cybersecurity as well. I mean, we've gone from a world of some what seems now, looking back, as some fairly rudimentary approaches to attacking infrastructure to some incredibly sophisticated cyber attacks, and some of which are state-sponsored. We've called for a digital Geneva Convention to bring the international community together and establish a set of rules that basically govern cybersecurity in a way that makes the internet safer for all citizens to use. Well, the thing we want to spend a few minutes on here is ethical AI. About a year ago, we published a book called Future Computed. I would encourage you to read it. It's a free download. It's about 70 pages, and maybe 20 of those pages are high-res imagery. So it's a quick read, but it lays out our principles for how we think about responsibility and ethics in this era. Ethics in tech is not a new discussion. It's been around for 100 years. But the pace of innovation, the pace at which things are changing makes the stakes much higher. What could go wrong tends to be a little bit more distributed, a little bit more vast. And so we've evolved a lot of our thinking around the idea that these systems need to be fair. They need to be fair to people. They need to be safe to use. They need to respect privacy. As we talked about, they need to be inclusive of different groups of people. They need to be transparent. This is an increasingly important thing. I think you would probably be correct to say the biggest advancement in machine learning in the last decade is, or the biggest advancement in AI, rather, in the last decade, is deep learning. I think that's a fair statement. The problem is the more accurate these models become, the less transparent they become. The more layers you add to your neural network, the blacker the black box becomes, the less explainable it is. So if you're a bank and you used a neural network to make a determination on whether or not someone should get a loan, and you deny them and they challenge you, and you don't have the ability to explain how this algorithm led to this decision to deny this person a loan, your business is exposed. So transparency, intelligibility, explainability become more important than ever before. Accountability is another key aspect of this. You know, if the march of human progress has taught us anything, it's that things will go wrong. Failure is essential to mastery. Things will go wrong, so understanding who's accountable, who's responsible, and what the remediation plan is critically important here. Probably the biggest discussion going on today with respect to fairness, or respect to fairness in machine learning, is machine learning bias. And I'm sure you've all read about this, familiar with this term. Why does bias exist in machine learning? And the answer is quite simple. It's because the data used to train these models comes from us, and human beings are biased. It was pointed out to me recently that the list of cognitive biases in the Wikipedia catalog of cognitive biases is getting close to 200. 200 biases that we all possess as human beings, and they all have very descriptive names. Selection bias, automation bias, reporting bias, availability bias, group attribution bias, and unfortunately, racial and gender bias. These all exist. Some of it is conscious, some of it is unconscious. So everything that we do, the telephone calls that we make, the things that we text, the movies we watch on Netflix, the places we go, the restaurants we dine at, the digital exhaust that we leave behind, that data is being used to train these models. So the idea that these models will be as biased as we are as human beings is mathematically inevitable. It's mathematically inevitable. Diversity looms large in this discussion. Teams that are diverse tend to not make mistakes that relate to gender and racial diversity. So if you have engineering teams that include women, that include people with racial and ethnic background, different racial and ethnic backgrounds, these teams don't tend to not ship models that end up doing reputational damage to companies because they're ahead of the problem. The awareness that it exists stops these things before they turn into shipping code. So if there's any skepticism, I think I've never met anyone in the tech industry who doesn't agree diversity is a good thing. But every now and then I'll get a question about what's the business case? What's the ROI? Someone with a financial background, they'll ask that question. This should be the thing that puts you over the top. The protection of your company against the reputational damage and embarrassment that can occur from accidentally shipping a machine learning model that ends up excluding a group of people completely unintentionally. That becomes incredibly important. So what do we do about this? Well, there's a number of different things. Machine learning bias detection tools are an emerging subsegment of the software industry that are coming up. We're working on that. A number of other companies are as well. We have a number of partners that have put ethicists on their payroll. I was actually quite surprised by this. It happened so quickly. Ethics training within technical teams. We're seeing more and more of that happening. Ethics content, actually, at events like this one. Documentation of data sets and how those things shape the outcome in the form of machine learning models. Why was this data set created? Who created it? Who is maintaining it? What were the use cases for which it was designed? What are the data points that comprise this thing? This is kind of an emerging space, but I think awareness that this situation exists, this problem exists, that it's a problem worth solving, is very important. So looking at the developer community writ large, it wasn't really clear to me how this topic was really trending or playing or even being talked about in the developer community. So I went to Stack Overflow's 2018 Dev Survey. Those of you familiar with it, it's definitely worth a read. 100,000 developers in 40 countries surveyed for this thing. 1% of those developers are from Austria. 1% probably doesn't sound like much, but it's 1,000 developers. It's statistically significant. And I just pulled a quick sampling of some of the questions, just to give you a sense of how your peers around the world are thinking about ethics in tech. First question here. What would developers do? What would you do if you were asked to write code for an unethical purpose? And the results came back. 60% said, no, I would not do it. But more than a third said, I'm not sure. It depends. And what this tells us is that there's a lot of subjectivity around right and wrong. If somebody phrased this question to you, what would you do if someone asked you to write code for an illegal purpose? You'd say, well, no, I don't want to go to jail. It's against the law. I'm not a lawbreaker. I would not do it. But when you start getting into right and wrong, it becomes very, very subjective. So as an example, it's wrong to lie. Lying is wrong. But would you lie to protect a close friend from having their feelings hurt? It depends, maybe. You may be able to morally justify that. So I think the opportunity here is for the training that certainly I never had when I was in engineering school. A lot of the faculty leaders that we talk to in universities will concede, yeah, it's not a real priority for us, even though MIT and Stanford are actually starting to include this sort of curriculum in their computer science programs. So this is an opportunity, I think, to bring some clarity to the whole ethics thinking into these sorts of conundrums and dilemmas. Another one that relates to accountability. Who's responsible when the code gets written and shipped and does something unethical? Well, the top line, almost 60% says upper management. And this is corporate governance 101. This is what investors and shareholders in publicly held companies expect, that the senior managers will assume accountability for whatever happens. But the other two, it's kind of weird. 1 out of 5 said the developer who wrote the code is to blame. I don't know quite how to think about that. What we take away from this is that there's really no consensus. There's no clarity on accountability and responsibility. So this notion of accountability as a principle understanding what the remediation strategy is and understand who's accountable and who owns it. That's a very important thing, I think, for any business to have. A startup company at the formative stage up to some of the world's biggest companies. Lastly, I'll share this one. Do developers have an obligation to even consider this? And I was most pleasantly surprised by the answer to this. Yes, overwhelmingly. And to be quite honest, I don't think the developer community gets enough credit. I don't think you get the credit you deserve for thinking along these lines, certainly from a lot of the industry pundits and big thinkers that I talk to. I think as a community, you're much farther along than people give you credit for, the fact that this is front and center. This is good news. This is a good thing. This is a foundation upon which we can build with discussion, open discussion, engagement, sharing of best practices, sharing of lessons learned. Things will go wrong, as we discussed, but that's okay. That's part of the process of getting better and better and better. So I just wanted to share this with you and kind of wrap it up with a quote from Hans Jonas. Hans Jonas is a contemporary German philosopher, 20th century German philosopher. He wrote a book published 40 years ago called The Imperative of Responsibility. This book was published in German in 1979. I think it showed up in English 5 years later. And it's basically a book that talks about the ethical and societal problems that are raised by technology. This book was written 40 years ago, so I think it's fair to say Hans Jonas is a little bit ahead of his time, or he was a very forward-thinking guy, as you would expect from a philosopher. But he was bang on with this. And basically what he's saying here is that think about your actions as if the future of humanity depends on it, which is kind of a heavy-duty ask of any community. But one of the things that I'd like you to appreciate is the power that you wield as the creators on the very front line of what will become the future of this era of tech. So rather than leave you with this heavyweight sort of massive thing, I just want to come back to the opportunity and give you a bit of inspiration on what's possible, what's happening today, and the power that this technology wields to transform businesses, transform the lives of people.
Artificial intelligence isn't coming. It's here. It's the defining technology of our time. But it's human ingenuity that makes it so powerful. Jane started losing her vision when she was 12. She uses Seeing AI.
Crept down the stairs and out the door,
which enables her to read and navigate her world. Microsoft AI is helping farmers adapt to climate change.
We can use technology to help feed the world without wrecking the planet.
Enabling wildlife conservation.
The ability to use AI really democratizes science. WildMe uses images from any source to help study endangered species.
And creating new ways for people with hearing loss to communicate.
I want the exact same information that my hearing friends have.
It's more than just imitating intelligence or sounding like a human. Microsoft AI is changing every industry, from healthcare.
And now you can see these finite details, the relationship with many structures.
To engineering. And telecommunications.
we are using artificial intelligence to change the way we are related to customers.
AI lets us put people first.
The Microsoft tools really enabled us to breathe digital life into an iconic brand persona.
The product that we make is not a thing in a box. Microsoft AI empowers others to create experiences and potential. This is just the beginning.
Artificial intelligence, it's just opened up this whole world.
The future we invent is a choice we make.
So I love futuristic demos of what's possible. When I see shipping technology today, changing people's lives, that's really where I get inspiration. So the opportunity is yours. I think the responsibility we share together. Microsoft is a platform provider, yourselves as a developer community. So with that, thank you very much.